Welcome back to Finance Empire. Real-life stories that don't just improve your English, but also make you feel every emotion hidden inside real, human struggles. Before we begin today's story, imagine this for a second. What would you do if someone walked into your life and offered you more money than you had ever seen? But in exchange, you had to erase a place filled with memories, people, and history? Would you choose comfort? Or would you stand your ground, even when the entire city was pushing against you? Today's story is emotional, powerful, and painfully realistic. It's about a man named Arthur, a tiny neighbourhood shop, and a city changing faster than the people inside it could survive. And while you listen, pay attention to the natural English phrases and emotional vocabulary. You'll hear expressions native speakers use when they talk about pressure, loyalty, fear, negotiation, greed, and community. So grab a coffee, relax, and step into the old streets of Arthur's neighbourhood before they disappear forever. The bell above the shop door rang softly at exactly 7 o'clock in the morning. It was the same sound Arthur had heard almost every day for 4 decades. To most people, it was just a little bell. But to Arthur, it sounded like routine, stability, and home. The cold morning air drifted inside as Mr. Henderson shuffled through the entrance wearing his long brown coat and old wool hat. He walked slowly now because of his knees, but he still came every morning for peppermint tea and the newspaper. "Morning, Arthur," he muttered. "Looks like the construction crew is back again. They started drilling before sunrise." Arthur sighed quietly while placing the tea into a paper bag. "Cities never sleep anymore, George," he replied. "They just rebuild themselves until nobody recognises them." Outside the window, the neighbourhood no longer looked like the place Arthur grew up in. The old laundromat had become a luxury coffee shop, where a single cup cost more than a loaf of bread in Arthur's store. The family-owned bakery down the street was now covered in giant posters, advertising luxury apartments with rooftop pools and private gyms. Even the sidewalks looked unfamiliar, clean, expensive, cold. Arthur watched young professionals in sharp coats walk past his dusty storefront without even glancing inside. Most of them had earbuds in their ears and phones in their hands. Nobody stopped to talk anymore. Years ago, this street felt alive. Neighbours sat outside during summer evenings. Children rode bicycles up and down the sidewalks. People borrowed sugar from each other and returned it with pie or homemade soup. Now everyone seemed to be rushing somewhere else. Arthur turned around and looked at the shelves lining his tiny shop. Every scratch in the wooden floor carried a memory. Every jar, every shelf, every faded corner of the building had survived storms, recessions, blackouts, and hard winters. His father had opened this store with almost nothing except determination and pride. Arthur still remembered helping stock shelves when he was only 10 years old. Back then, the store smelled like fresh oranges, coffee beans, and newspaper ink. And somehow, after all these years, it still did. Around noon, the shop became unusually quiet. Arthur was reorganising canned soup near the back aisle when the front door opened again. But this customer felt different immediately. The man walked with confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wore a perfectly tailored grey suit and polished shoes that looked too expensive for this neighbourhood. Instead of looking at the products, he examined the walls, ceiling height, and floor space, like an investor inspecting property. Arthur already knew what kind of man this was before he even spoke. "Mr. Arthur Vance?" the stranger asked smoothly. Arthur nodded once. The man extended his hand. "Marcus Thorne, Nexus Development." Arthur didn't shake it. Thorne smiled politely anyway and placed a thick white envelope onto the counter between them. "We're currently redeveloping this district into a modern residential corridor," he explained. "Your property occupies a very strategic position." Arthur stared at the envelope without touching it. "I'm not interested in selling," he replied calmly. Thorne's smile remained frozen on his face. "You haven't even looked at the number yet." "I don't need to." The developer leaned slightly closer. "With respect, Mr. Vance, sentimentality is expensive. This building is old. Maintenance costs are rising. Property taxes will continue increasing. At some point, you'll have to face reality." Arthur folded his arms slowly. "This shop is reality." For the first time, the friendliness disappeared from Thorne's eyes. "We're offering enough money for you to retire comfortably for the rest of your life," he said quietly. You could buy a beautiful home somewhere peaceful. No stress, no debt, no responsibilities. Arthur finally picked up the envelope, but only to place it back into the man's hands. "My father built this place," Arthur said, "and the people here helped keep it alive. I'm not selling them out." Thorne gave a slow, disappointed nod. "The city is changing, Arthur," he replied. "You can either move with it or get buried underneath it." Then he turned and walked out the door. The little bell chimed again, but this time the sound felt heavier. That evening, Arthur locked the shop later than usual. The streets outside glowed with modern neon signs and luxury advertisements. Everything around him looked brighter than before, yet somehow the neighbourhood felt darker. As he walked home carrying a small paper bag of leftover bread, he passed apartment buildings with moving trucks parked outside. Families were leaving quietly in the middle of the night because rent prices had become impossible. At the corner bus stop, Arthur saw Mrs. Gable sitting alone on a bench, clutching grocery bags against her chest. She looked worried. "They raised my rent again," she whispered when she noticed him. "I don't know how much longer I can stay here." Arthur sat beside her silently for a moment. The city used to take care of people like Mrs. Gable. Now it pushed them out like unwanted furniture. "They can't erase everybody," Arthur said eventually. Mrs. Gable looked towards the glowing construction cranes in the distance. "They don't have to erase everybody," she murmured sadly. "Just enough people until the rest feel alone." Those words followed Arthur all the way home. That night he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the buyout offer again. The amount printed at the bottom made his chest tighten. It was more money than he had ever imagined owning. Enough to fix his bad knees. Enough to stop worrying about overdue bills. Enough to finally rest after 40 exhausting years. For a brief moment he pictured himself living somewhere quiet near the ocean. No stress, no leaking roof, no paperwork, no fear. But then another image appeared in his mind. The shop replaced by cold glass towers, luxury apartments where nobody knew each other's names, a neighbourhood without history, without conversation, without soul. Arthur rubbed his tired eyes and looked toward the old photograph hanging beside the kitchen clock. It showed his father standing proudly outside the shop in 1979, wearing a flower-covered apron and smiling like the future belonged to him. Arthur suddenly realised something painful. The developers weren't just buying land, they were buying memory itself. The next morning, construction barriers appeared directly outside Arthur's store. Huge orange machines blocked the sidewalk while workers drilled into the pavement. Dust filled the air. The noise was unbearable. Customers struggled to enter the shop through the narrow, muddy pathway left between the barriers. By lunchtime, only 3 people had visited. Arthur stood by the front window watching workers destroy the street inch by inch. He knew exactly what this was. Pressure. If the business lost enough customers, Arthur would eventually become desperate enough to sell. It was legal, clean, professional, and absolutely cruel. Around 3 o'clock, Marcus Thorne returned. This time he carried no envelope, only confidence. "Business seems slow today," he observed while brushing dust from his coat sleeve. Arthur kept wiping the counter without answering. "The construction timeline is flexible," Thorne continued casually. "These projects can last weeks, or months." Arthur looked up sharply. "What do you want?" Thorne smiled. "I already told you. Progress." The developer stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You're fighting a city that has already made its decision. Every business around you will disappear eventually. Why suffer through the process?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "This neighbourhood isn't just property." "No," Thorne replied. "It's opportunity." Arthur felt anger rise inside his chest, but underneath the anger was fear. Because part of him knew the developer might be right. Cities rarely protect small people. They protect money. After Thorne left, Arthur stood alone in the dusty silence of the shop. Outside, jackhammers pounded the pavement like war drums. For the first time in 40 years, Arthur wondered if he was losing. But then the bell above the door rang again. A young mother named Elena entered, holding her daughter's hand. She looked exhausted. "I'm sorry, Arthur," she said softly while counting coins onto the counter. "I'm short again." Arthur looked at the tiny pile of change, then he pushed the milk and bread gently toward her. "Pay next week," he said. Relief flooded across Elena's face instantly. "Thank you," she whispered. Arthur watched her leave and suddenly understood something Marcus Thorne never would. A luxury tower could sell expensive coffee. It could sell designer furniture. It could sell comfort. But it could never replace trust. And trust was the real foundation of the neighbourhood. That evening, Arthur unlocked the old storage room behind the shop and found a dusty leather ledger his father used decades ago. Inside were names, handwritten notes, and forgotten stories. Paid back in homemade soup. Helped during winter blackout. Family couldn't afford groceries this month. Arthur smiled sadly while turning the fragile pages. This little shop had quietly carried people through hard times for generations. The developers only saw bricks. Arthur saw lives. And deep in his heart, a decision was finally beginning to form. He wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. And in the next part of this story, the pressure will become even more dangerous. The developers will stop asking politely. The city council will get involved. And Arthur will discover that saving a neighbourhood may cost him everything he has left. So if you enjoyed this emotional real-life English story, make sure you subscribe, relax and prepare for part 2, because the real fight is only beginning. Arthur locked the shop doors later than usual that night. The construction noise had finally stopped, but the silence that replaced it felt strangely unsettling. He switched off the front lights one by one until only the small lamp above the register remained glowing softly in the darkness. The old shop looked tired, not broken, just exhausted. Arthur slowly walked through the aisles, running his fingertips along the wooden shelves his father had built by hand decades ago. The wood was scratched and faded now, but every mark carried history. Near the back corner, he paused beside the small refrigerator that hummed louder every year. The electricity bill taped beside it made his stomach tighten. He was losing money almost every week now. The truth was painful. Marcus Thorne didn't need to destroy the shop directly. Time itself was already doing part of the work for him. Arthur sat behind the counter and opened the old leather ledger again. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the front windows. He flipped through page after page of names from another era, families who had trusted this little store during their hardest moments. Then he stopped suddenly at a familiar name. Maria Alvarez, groceries during winter strike. Arthur smiled faintly. Maria used to come into the shop carrying her 2 small boys bundled in oversized winter coats. Her husband had lost his factory job during a brutal economic downturn nearly 30 years earlier. Most stores refused to give credit back then. Arthur's father hadn't. For nearly 3 months, the Alvarez family survived because the shop allowed them to take food and pay later when life improved, and they did pay it back. Every penny. But that wasn't the point. The point was that someone had trusted them when the world treated them like failures. Arthur leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Modern businesses talk constantly about efficiency, optimization, and profit margins. Nobody talked about mercy anymore. Suddenly, headlights swept across the front window. Arthur looked up as a black luxury car parked outside the shop. A moment later, the bell above the door chimed again. But it wasn't Marcus Thorne this time. A younger woman stepped carefully inside, carrying a dark umbrella. She looked professional, but not cold. Tired, maybe. "Sorry for coming so late," she said politely. "My name is Maya. I work for Nexus Development." Arthur's expression hardened immediately. "If you're here about the offer, my answer hasn't changed." "I know," Maya replied softly. "And honestly, I didn't come to pressure you." Arthur didn't respond. He simply watched her cautiously. Maya glanced around the tiny store before speaking again. "My grandfather owned a bookstore when I was growing up," she said quietly. "It disappeared during redevelopment too." That surprised Arthur. "Then why work for people like Thorne?" he asked bluntly. Maya gave a tired smile. "Because cities keep changing whether we like it or not." Rain hammered harder outside now, filling the silence between them. Finally, Maya reached into her coat pocket and placed a folded paper onto the counter. "It's tomorrow's construction schedule," she explained. "They're planning to shut down water access on this side of the block for almost 2 days." Arthur frowned deeply. "They can't do that." "They can," Maya replied. "At least legally." Arthur felt anger rise inside him again. "This isn't development," he muttered bitterly. "It's suffocation." Maya looked down at the floor for several seconds before answering. "Marcus believes pressure creates cooperation." Arthur laughed quietly, but there was no humour in it. No, he said. Pressure creates resentment. For the first time, Maya looked genuinely uncomfortable. You should know something, she admitted carefully. The company expected you to sell immediately. Nobody thought the neighbourhood would support you this much. Arthur stared at her. These people aren't customers, he replied. They're family. Maya nodded slowly, like she finally understood something important. When she left, Arthur remained standing behind the counter, listening to the fading sound of rain outside. Then he unfolded the construction notice again. Water shutdown, sidewalk closure, utility disruption. The pressure was escalating. And deep down, Arthur realised something terrifying. This fight was no longer just about one little shop. If Nexus Development succeeded here, every remaining family-owned business on the block would eventually disappear too. The barber shop, the flower stand, the tiny laundromat run by the Chen family. All of them would be replaced by expensive spaces designed for people with money instead of history. Arthur suddenly felt very small. One old man against corporations, lawyers, investors, and city officials. It sounded impossible. But then another thought entered his mind. Maybe the neighbourhood didn't need a hero. Maybe it just needed someone willing to refuse. The next morning, Arthur arrived before sunrise. The street was quiet except for distant construction equipment warming up in the cold air. He unlocked the shop and stared at the blank front window for a long moment. Then he grabbed a thick black marker and a large piece of cardboard. Slowly, carefully, he wrote 3 words in bold letters. This shop stays. He taped the sign directly onto the front glass where every passing person could see it. At first nothing happened. Then around 8 o'clock, Mr. Henderson stopped outside the window and smiled proudly. By 9, Elena shared a photograph of the sign online. By noon, dozens of neighbours had reposted it across social media. And by evening, people Arthur had never even met were walking into the shop just to shake his hand. A college student bought chewing gum she didn't need. An elderly couple purchased tea and canned soup. Construction workers secretly came during lunch breaks to buy sandwiches and whisper words of encouragement. The shop suddenly felt alive again, not because business was booming, but because people were finally realising what was at stake. Arthur stood behind the register watching neighbours laugh, talk and support one another beneath the warm yellow lights. For the first time in weeks, hope quietly entered the room. And somewhere across the city, Marcus Thorne was beginning to realise that removing one stubborn old shopkeeper might be much harder than he expected.